Jeune here with your Asian Racing Review. I'm joined as always by Michael Cox, editor of the AsianRacingReport.com. Plenty to get through this week, Michael. We've got racing from Japan, Jesuda Kinen weekend, Hong Kong, a few talking points from there. There's the Derby in the UK on the weekend, and as such was a World Pool meeting, and one particular event we want to hone in on that as far as that is concerned. We start off though, Michael, in Singapore. This is a story that you wrote about last week, about rumours of possibly racing coming to end in Singapore, but at a press conference on Monday night, that unfortunately has borne out to be true.
Yeah, press conference called, and Singapore Turf Club calling the trainers and participants into a meeting and staff at the Singapore Turf Club. After 180 years, the Singapore Turf Club will cease racing. A sudden announcement, a shock announcement. As you mentioned, at Asian Racing Report, we wrote a column last week reporting that there were rampant rumours that Singapore racing would cease in 2026. They were being repeated at a consistent rate. Now, we wouldn't normally report a rumour. I think it's important to point out that we reported that there was a rumour, and that the comment piece was about the need for the Singapore Turf Club to speak up and provide clarity and leadership. Well, they certainly provided clarity on Monday when they called the trainers in and said there'll be no more racing in 16 months' time, October 5, 2024. Shock announcement. It's left many sad around the racing world, and there's a lot to unpack here.
So what happens? Okay, so they've given us a date, which is great, but surely it can't keep operating at full steam until that point and then just end. So what happens?
Well, this is the
now and
concern.
then?
This is the concern raised by Michael Clements, the president of the Trainers Association there in Singapore, and other participants. 700 horses in Singapore, and the first question from the participants was, what about the horses and what about rehoming? I mean, people just last week at the Magic Millions sale, Australian yearling sale, were purchasing horses for Singapore. There's horses in quarantine waiting to go to Singapore. There seems to be a disconnect, and maybe that's an underlying issue in where we find ourselves with the situation with racing in Singapore, is that there's a disconnect and a lack of understanding between the board and the people who run racing in Singapore, not just the board level, but the executives too. People employed to run the sport of horse racing in Singapore don't understand the sport, think that, well, I don't know what they think is going to happen if they... I've spoken to executives from the Singapore Turf Club, you know, for Asian Racing Report, sat down with them, and I sat down with one executive just before the inception of Asian Racing Report. This person didn't know a thing about horse racing. This is the type, you know, when you talk to someone and you say, yeah, I write about horse racing or I speak about horse racing, and they say, tell me something. Do the jockeys bring the horses to the track? It's like, how does it work? You know, when there's someone that clueless about horse, you know the type. You talk to normal people. I sometimes do, and that's the sort of thing they say. That's what an executive from the Singapore Turf Club asked me. This is the level of understanding. And this is now the concern. Okay, the land is required for housing. There's a housing shortage in Singapore. We appreciate that. That's part of the story, and it's important to keep perspective on that the club was under pressure, and it's because of mismanagement and poor returns to government and not placing itself there that it's in this situation. But it's also because there are people there to represent the club's interests and racing interests that don't understand racing. They probably don't have racing's best interests at heart, as it would seem. There doesn't seem to be much advocacy there. And there was definitely a lack of communication. So what now? Why do they think that trainers, especially expatriate trainers, you need to find another job within 14 months. You don't need to keep supporting Singapore racing. There's talk of a $700 Singapore per month allowance to keep horses in training to try and keep racing going to that date. But if you're a successful trainer in Singapore, you need to be making plans, and you need to jump at when an opportunity comes to relocate, it needs to be done quickly. So I think that was the concern when the rumours were reported earlier, that it was stopping the growth, and whether the date was 2026 if you announce that racing is going to close in 2026, the concern was, well, it's not even going to last until 2024, because why buy a horse for Singapore? Why reinvest? Why stake your future in the sport there? And now that the end date is October 5, 2024, why stick around at all? I've got grave concerns for the immediate future of Singapore racing, and I don't think, for mine, if I'm having a bet, I don't know that there'll be a meeting on October 5, 2024. And if there is, I'm not sure what the field size is or who will be participating there. It's very sad. And on the score of, something that we tried to do in our reporting after the announcement was stick to the human side of the story and get the reactions. And what people are upset with is the way the information was delivered to them, the lack of communication. And I'm still hearing from trainers and participants now who found out about the announcement officially via a press release, via email. No communication about what the plan is. I mean, this, in the end, this is a decision being made by government. I appreciate that. And that the Singapore Turf Club are hearing that decision, and maybe they're being caught unawares as well. Maybe they haven't been included in discussions. But whatever the case, there's a bunch of people and a little more than 700 horses to take care of. The newsletter we put out today and a piece I've written today is that the story's not over. The Singapore Turf Club hasn't finished operation, and they still have a really important job to do to take care of the welfare of those people and those horses.
What can other racing jurisdictions learn from this, and where, I suppose, in some respects, because Singapore is a one-course town, so effectively it's one race course that's being closed down. It's happened in the UK. There was Kempton was going to be closed down a few years ago. So things like this can happen, but Singapore, the fact that it's very nature. There's just one race course there. You close that course down, it's gone. So what can anybody else watching this, other administrations, learn, do you think?
Well, in that way, it's a fascinating little case study, isn't it? It's like a control environment, and that's one of the things. So we start with what Singapore had going for it that other places don't have going for it. Because something I've heard that I think needs to be addressed is that, well, that's sad, but it couldn't happen here. Well, why not? If let's look at some of the elements. Let's look at some of the things Singapore had going for it. A great track and great facilities. A protected tote monopoly. Yes, 2 casinos came in. Yes, illegal gambling became big. But in the end, they had a tote only protected space there to operate in, and a rich history of racing. And I've heard these comparisons with Hong Kong, where it's like, that Hong Kong racing is more entrenched, and Hong Kong, Singapore racing is celebrating 180 years. It's old and it has a history, and there was dedicated fan base there. So they had a lot going for it. What brought it undone? I mean, these are elements that exist everywhere. Land, prime land, and a housing shortage. A board that wasn't as interested in horse racing as it was in furthering for political gain, perhaps, or looking at the future, or maybe even, I don't know, real estate and perhaps self-interest, doing what they felt was right. A lack of independent media. The groundwork was there. These things lack, and the reason why a lack of independent media matters is that who was there to advocate for this? Who was there to sort of be the reflecting part, that role that the media is meant to play, to find out, to keep the spotlight and the scrutiny on the decision makers. This was allowed to slide for a very long time without much scrutiny or questions being asked. The horse population dropped to probably a critically low level. Turnover dropped, over taxation. We've got a government there hell bent on regulation and restricting racing. So why couldn't it happen there? The lessons to take away from it: if you're a racing participant, some unity is needed. Some you have to advocate for yourself. And you say, the question I've asked in the piece I've written today is, do you know You know, if you're a racing participant and you're watching this, or you're a racing fan, or you have an interest in horse racing as an ongoing concern, do you know who is on the board of your local jurisdiction? Do you know what their background is? Do you know who they represent? Do you know what the turnover figures are?
Okay. Cautionary tale. I mentioned, I used the UK as an example. There's been a number of famous tracks in the US that have been closed over the years as well, which you wouldn't have thought 10, 15, 20 years ago would have happened. But there will be no, as I understand it, no stay of execution here, no 11th hour call from the governor. This is it. We're just on a...
Well, there will be, if it will be a stay of execution, but it will be a delayed one. It won't, if there is one, and that's what we're hearing from the trainers, that some are asking for just a few more years. You know, we're dealing with people's livelihoods here, and if you read David Morgan and my piece today, we've spoken to a number of participants, and that's the common message. No one's fighting the actual decision. No one's saying that Singapore racing is going to continue, but can you just please give us 2 or 3 more years to ensure that we can figure out our futures, find proper homes for these horses, transition to another job, perhaps, for some people.
I think when they lost, without dwelling on the fact too much, when they lost the international races as well, they sort of lost a little bit of relevance maybe in terms of international racing. It just became very much I know a few horses, there was travel to Hong Kong, but it became very much a one racing jurisdiction to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think that the removal of those races was one of the many early warning signs for a club that no longer cared so much about, the sport itself.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll move on from there. I'm sure there might be still some news to come from that. But Singapore to cease racing in 2024. To Japan, Kynan on the weekend. Sort of clash of the milers again. It was Sadashi and Songline who'd ran 1-2 in the Victoria Mile. It's turned out that Songline was a bit too good again, going back to back.
She's the standout miler in Japan. We were probably looking at it before this, and I'm not sure what, she probably deserved to be known as that before, after winning last year's Kynan. She'd already won in Saudi Arabia there, and then the Victoria Mile, but now undisputed miler champion of Japan. Songline, widest gate, 3 wide the trip, no excuses for anyone else. Look, where does she go next? If she's already travelled a couple of times, she's going to be a real force on the world stage wherever they go with her.
Yeah, and possibly, obviously, though, it's a few of them like Schnellmeister, much better run from him, flashing home to finish 3rd. Maybe thinking about Hong Kong later in the year.
Yeah, that's the obvious target, and it's a race where Japan have proven to be pretty competitive, and yeah, it's Hong Kong's sweet spot too. So hopefully we see Songline versus Golden 60 perhaps later in the year.
Could be the swan song. Speaking of Hong Kong, a couple of talking points out of the weekend. Lucky Sweynesse wins again under a big weight, still very impressive, and equalled Beauty Generation's record for wins in a year.
Yeah, he was a surprise entry. I didn't see that one coming on before the...
Nor did Francis Loy, actually, either. It was bemoaning the fact that because he's got Cordyceps 6 now. He said the last horse he expected to bump into was Lucky Sweynesse.
Yeah, that would have upset him when he saw his name in the entries. It's just it was a good effort there to lump that big weight against. Look, yeah, he was $1.40. I don't think he did what he needed to do. Tradesman-like, well done, 8 wins, but they teased us a little bit with the talk about going to the Kynan after the last start win, and I'd respect a nice 5th in the Kynan more than I respect that win. But anyway, that's just me.
Yeah. Well, he's been busy. I think he ran on the last day of the season last year, Lucky Sweynesse, and the first day of the season this year as well. But I assume that he's now earned himself a little break.
Well, there's no more races for him.
Manfred could find one.
Do you want a Chief Executives Cup on day 1 of next season?
Possibly.
Do you want to, we can have a bet right now. Let's see. Even money, flip of a coin.
What I want to see...
I'll say you run.
What I want to see...
I think we'll see him on day 1 with
Lucky
£135.
Golden 60, California Spaniel for good measure as well, the Celebration Cup. That won't happen either.
Celebration October 1?
1,400 metres.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, Lucky Sweynesse will probably be 3rd up, judging by the racing pattern so far.
Zac Purton was on board Lucky Sweynesse, of course, and he's still on this run chase to catch Joe Moreira's all-time win record for a season.
Yeah, he now needs, as we record this on a Tuesday before the Wednesday Happy Valley meeting, 24 wins from 12 fixtures remaining in the season. It's exciting. It is really, pondering it during the week. It's Joe Moreira's obviously departed Hong Kong, doing his farewell world tour, running around the world, but it's still, that rivalry still burns because it's still Zac Purton versus Joe Moreira now. It's Zac chasing Joe's 170, and I think it really adds to the Hong Kong season. I love that there's a defined start and finish of the season, and that we build towards this season finale. And I can't imagine that I think Zac will get there, or he'll be within striking distance when it comes down to that final meeting. It's hard to imagine putting it away before then, but he's going to need one or two at that final meeting, and it just sets it up for. It's going to be great to watch over the final month or 5 weeks of the season.
Yeah, and twilight meetings as well. I called out a few people towards the end of the meeting though with the Shah 10 meetings. New trainer for next season as well. He was in the running for a licence last year, beaten to the punch by Pierre Hong, but Cody Mo.
Yeah, Cody Mo, next in line for a long time. Cody Mo, he's been sort of beaten out by a few long-time assistants. Tony Cruz. Be interesting to see what Cody's style is. Tony Cruz has a very distinctive style. For those who aren't familiar with Hong Kong racing, or maybe don't watch it as closely, Cody worked for Tony Cruz, who was once a great jockey, known for being an aggressive front-running jockey in Hong Kong, and rode around the world with great success. But as a trainer, he's probably like the Gay Waterhouse of Hong Kong, in that his horses are right up to the mark. You would never say one's unfit, and they race regularly, and they regularly race handy in the field. So Cody takes on the sort of style of his former boss, Tony Cruz. One thing for sure, he will never have as great a hair as Tony Cruz. That's the only other comment I've got. Great to see. Look, just watch this space there on that and the Hong Kong training situation. We've got a couple of trainers yet to qualify for next season under the 3 strikes rule for the benchmark performance criteria. If you don't reach a certain level of performance, usually just a base rate of wins, it's become a little more convoluted over the recent seasons. But Peter Ho and Michael Chang are both on 2 strikes. Michael Chang looks more than likely to scrape by. Peter Ho looking less than likely to scrape by. If both of those trainers miss out, maybe could we see another appointment?
Possibly from Singapore.
Be plenty of people throwing in applications.
Final points this week. It was a derby at Epsom. Went to Aidan O'Brien winning his 9th. With August Rodin, who bounced back from his Guinness disappointment. But the talking point came in the Epsom Dash 5 furlong sprint, when at least 4, possibly 5 horses affected by the gates not opening, but the stewards deemed that they had afforded a fair start. Didn't make a difference either way. The race wasn't voided, and the punters essentially lost their money. What are your thoughts there?
Well, it brings to mind a race in 2016 at Happy Valley when DB Pin, who went on to win at the highest level in Hong Kong, was racing in a class 4 or a class 3, and the gates, a garden rake left leaning on the barriers, caused a malfunction. Some of the horses were denied a fair start, deemed to, and the entire race was deemed void, refunding I think around $130 million Hong Kong worth of bets. DB Penn won the race.
I haven't watched it for a long time, but I actually think he was one of the horses that was affected.
He was, and he absolutely bolted in. And then he went out next start.
They ran the race again, essentially the same field.
Which will still stand. I don't think I'll ever write a better form comment for a nap, my nap in the South China Morning Post for the next race, the little blurb. A garden rake beat him last start, but it won't this time. It was just a certainty next start, DB Ping, because he ran electric time, but then came back to scale. Now, look, my point, I think it's an issue we've spoken about it here with regards to rules harmonisation. So the World Pool now is a great initiative. It's the merging of pools around the world, and tote pools. It reinvigorates the tote in England and in other countries. So people betting into the same parimutuel pool for races, including from Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong have high standards of stewarding, and they call and advocacy for the punter. So, in the case of DB Penn, all bets refunded. Now, it might have upset people who backed DB Penn, but it was about fairness and a spirit of sort of transparency and punter confidence. But at what stage, when Hong Kong's punters are making up most of these pools, when they are the biggest customers there, do Hong Kong start to lean on other jurisdictions to maybe raise their standards? Look, I think it's a good thing. I'm not criticizing, but I think that they should. I think that the Hong Kong Jockey Club should take a proactive approach and show some leadership around the world and say, well, if you want the money from World Pool, if you want the money from these events, well, we have to protect our customers' interests. If a customer walks into a betting shop in Kowloon to bet on Sha Tin or Epsom, I think they should somehow expect similar standards and rules, and it's just something to look at. I thought that, there's obviously a lot of noise around from trainers that were affected by it, but I'll tell you what, there would have been a lot more noise in the betting shops of Hong Kong when the favourite jumps clearly on the field. If you watch this footage that was displayed from the helmet cam of
Kieran O'Neill,
probably the horse most notably affected, the favourite, and these were four horses, three of them single figures in betting. I mean, it's actually, there's an opportunity there, is the way I'm trying to frame this. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm saying there's an opportunity there to say, hey, let's have some. This could be the catalyst to really get rules harmonisation and some, not just, rules harmonisation, we usually talk about it with regards to whip rules. But what about some just common standards and some common rules when it comes to like handling horses in barriers? I know these are finer points and details, but there's a lot of money at stake. And I think it's for the betterment of the sport as a whole.
Yeah, worth pointing out, I think of the horses affected, they held nearly 50% of the pool, something like that. Kieran did take to Twitter. He said, in the words of the BHA, not materially affected is how they saw the horses. And it is one of the fastest 5 furlong race in the world. The winner ran 2 sub-10-second furlongs. You're going that quick. Doesn't matter how small the margin is at the start, obviously. To my mind, anyway, it's going to make
if those are the sectionals through the middle, it's not a race where you want to be losing position at the start.
No, quite frankly. All right, there we go. And of course, UK will be in the spotlight as well in a couple of weeks' time with World Pool betting on Royal Ascot, which isn't too far away. Anything else on the site to look out for this week?
Yeah, plenty of great stuff coming up. Make sure you go to the site, sign up for our newsletters. This week, we're starting a new newsletter on a Wednesday. David Morgan on Japan. We're going to take a deep dive into Japanese racing each week from our chief journalist, David Morgan, who I think, without bias, is the foremost expert in the English language on Japanese racing. He writes some great features, has some great insight, has travelled there to cover races many, many times. So Wednesdays, look out for that. David Morgan on Japan. And more great stuff from Asian Racing Report. All
right, of course, the late, great Deep Impact Saring, this year's Derby winner as well in the UK. And almost forgot Joe Moreira. Your interview with him is out in full now, is it?
Yeah, all 3 parts of Joe Moreira Unbridled. First part dealing with what horses have taught me from Joe Moreira. Some great insight into that. He really has a special relationship with horses, Joe. The way he interacts with them is quite unique. And then some comparisons in part 2 between the beasts of the East, Abel Friend and Morris. And then finally some, bit of reflective chat there with Joe about his departure from Hong Kong, how he feels about it now, his rivalry with Zac Purton, and why he rides in Brazil in races, Group 1s that are worth about as much as a Class 5 handicap in Hong Kong. It's I really enjoyed the chat, and I hope you do too. It's there on our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe there.
All right, many thanks as always, Michael. Yeah, like and subscribe. Keep following us on all the major social channels and tuning in as well for more from Asian Racing Review.